Today, my guest is author Deborah Harkness, who will be speaking about her debut novel, A Discovery of Witches, released last month by Viking, a division of Penguin Group. Now, Deborah is a professor of history at the University of Southern California and has received Fulbright, Guggenheim, and National Humanities Center fellowships. And her most recent scholarly work is The Jewel House, Elizabethan London and the Scientific Revolution. But she also has a wonderful award-winning wine blog, Good Wine Under 20 blogspot.com. We'll talk to her about that. Wine fits into her stories. But I want to also say, before I do bring her on, that A Discovery of Witches is poised to be the next supernatural literary sensation, some comparing it to Harry Potter and the winning vampire series. But it's for adults. It created a stir at the 2009 Frankfurt Book Fair with rights now sold in 33 countries, all for trade publications have raved about the novel, calling it compelling, enchanting, entertaining, and complex. Well, Deborah, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Jacqueline. Pleasure to be here.
Well, to get that kind of comparison is really terrific. And I want to start right out with this. Let's have you give a brief overview of the story.
All right. Well, this is a story about a reluctant witch named Diana Bishop, who comes from a very long and distinguished line of witches going all the way back to Salem, Massachusetts. And she has grown up not wanting to have anything to do with the family business of magic. And so she's created a very orderly life for herself as a historian. And one day that orderly life starts to come apart at the seams when she calls up a book at Oxford's Bodleian Library that happens to be enchanted. And even though she returns the book quickly and thinks that there's been no harm done, in fact, what she doesn't know is that many, many creatures have been looking for this manuscript for a very long time. And at the head of the line of interested parties is a 1,500-year-old French vampire and scientist named Matthew Clairmont.
And we're going to talk about the characters in a little while, too. This is really a fun and interesting story. And the book is set in the winding lanes of Oxford, a gargantuan castle in the south of France, in a creaky old house with a mind of its own in upstate New York. Now, all of these places, I think, were inspired by locations in your own life. Isn't that correct?
All but the castle, I'm afraid to say.
Okay.
The castle's wishful thinking, but yes, I spent a great deal of time at Oxford as a graduate student and as a scholar, as a researcher, and I lived for 3 years in upstate New York in a very creaky old house. So they are familiar locations to me.
Now, I'm curious where in upstate New York, because I'm from upstate New York.
All right. Well, I taught at Colgate University in Hamilton for 3 years.
Yes.
So was very well acquainted with 144-inch snowfall and the wonderful friendliness of people who live there.
Absolutely.
A wonderful, wonderful place to live. I miss it a great deal, so I got to put it in a novel.
That's great. Yes, it's a gorgeous part of the country, even with the snow, and I think that's what inspires people to be so friendly. Everyone depends upon each other. They spend a lot of time inside, and I was so glad that you did do that. Now, this is a world where vampires and witches drink wine together, practice yoga, and discuss philosophy. So these are very special people. And as I said in the introduction, you write an award-winning wine blog. Now, are these characters based on something you found missing in the fantasy genre, and that's why you wrote this novel, among other reasons, I'm sure?
Well, I have to say that as a historian, I mostly read nonfiction, so it's not that I found anything just missing in the fantasy genre, because I honestly don't have the opportunity, alas, to read much fictional books. But what it was really about came from a fascination with why people in our modern time, which we think of as being so scientific, would have the same kind of fascination for witches and demons and ghosts and things that go bump in the night like vampires as the people I study who lived way back in the 16th century. Because that difference, we think of ourselves as being so very different from the people back then, and yet our reading tastes show that we're very similar in some ways.
Yes, and I just wonder if that isn't something that's deep, deep, deep in the primitive side of us that does exist from way back that brings that fascination, even though we are so intelligent, quote unquote, so into the now and everything.
And the technology.
That remains there. And I think there's still a tiny bit of superstitious and fear that we tend to push deep, deep, deep inside. But I also read, I believe I read that you did make a comment about the fact that you were aware of Harry Potter, of course, things like Harry Potter and Magic and Witches, and then the Vampire series, and adults were reading their kids' books. So this is so timely.
Absolutely. I have so many friends who confess that they are reading Harry Potter to their children, and that they are sneaking off with those books and continuing to read when their children have fallen asleep because they can't bear to put it down. And I think it is about a kind of not just fear that we've buried deep, but also I think we as adults need to believe that maybe, just maybe, there is room for magic and limitless possibility.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
In our lives.
Yes, really. We are looking for those magical moments. And people that have premonitions and feelings and everything, I think they find that happens. Now, in the time that you study, in that time frame that you study, for instance, if an individual has a dream or a thought, let's say about an individual or some kind of being enveloping them and putting their arms around them, would they feel that they were a witch or that magic, and then that event happened? And I'm relating that to premonitions that people have today or dreams that they have today. But at that time, would that have been considered a good thing or a worrisome thing, or what would the reaction have been to something like that?
Well, what I always tell my students at USC is that magic, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, in a certain kind of community, if you had a certain kind of standing, you may well have been regarded as a kind of saint. And because
really,
saints have visions.
That's
saints see
right.
Things that are coming to pass. In another context, in a different community with a different set of problems, a very similar thing could get you into a whole heap of trouble, and you could be labeled a witch. In another community, you might be the local wise woman who everybody went to for advice because her premonitions were so accurate. I mean, they don't have the nightly news. If you could predict that the rain was coming the next day, you could save a whole village from starvation.
How about that? Do you cover things like that in this story?
A little bit. I definitely touch on them. I mean, one of the things that the Bishop family, Diana's family, has learned is that, it's very good for them to be part of a community. It's one of the reasons they love being in upstate New York, because they've proven their worth and their value to the community. The community is no longer afraid of them. So they are, in fact, the wise women of the area. And that's really what most witches have been historically. They were the women who brought babies into the world. They served their communities as undertakers and morticians before there was that profession. They provided medical care. They were really an invaluable part of the community. And it was a very specific moment in Western European history where they began to be targeted as undesirable and people to be feared.
Yes. Now, in the story, is it known in upstate New York that they are, in fact, witches, even though they're looked at as wise women?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I mean,
we don't want to give too much away, but...
Right. No, I mean, one of the things, again, that this book tried to do was tried to say, all right, what if there really are witches and ghosts and vampires and demons around us? How do they survive? And what crazy stories do humans tell themselves so that they can deny what's happening around them?
Right. I'm looking forward to getting more into the book. I have started it, but there's a lot no, there's a lot to digest. Now, the title of the novel, I found this interesting. The title of your novel, and I am talking to Deborah Harkness about her debut novel, A Discovery of Witches. And the title, A Discovery of Witches, was based on a book written by the English witch finder general Matthew Hopkins in 1647. Now, what was that writing used for during that period in 1647?
Well, the legend about Matthew Hopkins was that he had a book, and in that book were written all the names of all the witches who lived in England and the means by which you could search them down and exterminate them. So Matthew Hopkins' book was really used as a guideline for how to discover witches living among you so you could protect yourself. And his book was used by people who were trying to persecute and prosecute these women for crimes.
And was that about the time that witch hunting started in Europe in the 1600s, or had it started earlier?
It actually started really starts up in the 15th century, so the late 1400s, and it had been mounting. And one of the last significant witch hunts actually happened in Salem in the American colonies in 1692. So by that point, it was kind of dying out.
Yes, I think we're more familiar with, of course, the Salem witch hunt because that's in our own country. But I certainly love this type of history, and I think you're going to find that everybody else does too. Now, A Discovery of Witches begins with the protagonist, Diana Bishop, who you've mentioned, finding the lost enchanted manuscript with magical powers, and it's called the Ashmole 782 in Oxford's, I don't know, is it Bodleian Library?
Bodleian, absolutely.
The Bodleian
You got it
Library.
Right.
Okay. And you had a similar experience as your protagonist did while you were completing your dissertation. Now, how did that find inspire you in the creation of this novel?
Well, what I learned about writing A Discovery of Witches was that all kinds of experiences from your life are alchemically transformed through the act of writing into stories for your characters. So in 1994, when I was at Oxford's Bodleian Library doing research, I was finished my dissertation, but I was about to start my first job at Colgate. And I was in the library and poking around, and I literally, by accident, just as Diana did, found a lost book of magical spells that had been owned by John Dee, who was Queen Elizabeth I's court astrologer. And it had been missing since the early 1600s. Nobody knew where it was, and there it was in the Bodleian, hiding in plain sight. And I called it up, and I couldn't quite believe that this was happening.
How exciting.
Came up, and there it was, and I wrote a note to the keeper of rare books at the time and said, I think I found John Dee's lost book. And the next morning when I went into the library, they said, the keeper wishes to see you. And that was the moment I really arrived at the Bodleian Library, was when I found this book. So as I was again thinking about my imaginary world and the witch and vampire who were interested in science and magic, I thought, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if they found a lost manuscript, and if that, like I did, and wouldn't it be great if that lost manuscript had a mysterious set of contents that nobody could quite make out?
I just want to mention very quickly, this is the first book in a trilogy, and we're going to see more from you. And I'm so sorry to say that we are out of time. This is a fascinating book, A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness, and I'm loving reading it. So thank you so much for being here, Deborah.
Thank you, Jacqueline. It was a pleasure.
You're very welcome. This is the Jacqueline Bacher Show. Hold on. We'll be right back.